In the coastal waters of central Vietnam, where the South China Sea meets ancient shorelines, there stand towers. Red brick towers, rising from rice paddies and jungle clearings, their surfaces carved with dancing gods and celestial beings.
They are weathered, crumbling, reclaimed slowly by vegetation.
But these towers are tombstones, markers of a civilization that once commanded these coasts.
That built a maritime empire stretching across Southeast Asian waters, that created art so exquisite.
It influenced cultures from Java to Cambodia. These towers are all that remain, visible.
And the question that haunts every historian who studies them is simple and terrible. How does an entire civilization vanish?
Not decline gradually, not transform into something else, vanish.
The Cham people still exist, scattered in small communities across Vietnam, Cambodia, and the diaspora.
But the kingdom, the culture, the language, the power, the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years of civilization, gone.
Erased so thoroughly that most people today have never heard the name Champa.
Tonight, we investigate one of Southeast Asia's greatest mysteries. The disappearance of a kingdom that should have endured, and the forces that wrote it out of history. Let's establish what we're dealing with.
Champa was not a minor principality or a flash-in-the-pan power.
This was a sophisticated civilization that lasted for over 14 centuries. From approximately
14 centuries. That's longer than the Byzantine Empire. Nearly as long as the Roman Empire if you count both its western and eastern phases.
During its height, between the 7th and 10th centuries, Champa was one of the major players in Southeast Asian geopolitics. A naval power that controlled critical maritime trade routes between China and the Indian Ocean.
The Cham built in brick and stone when their neighbors built in wood. They developed a written language based on Sanskrit.
They created a unique form of Hinduism, blended with indigenous beliefs.
Constructing temple complexes that rivaled Angkor Wat in ambition, if not in scale.
They were master shipbuilders, traders who carried goods across thousands of miles of open ocean.
Spices, silk, ceramics, precious metals, all of it flowed through Cham harbors.
They produced art, particularly sculpture, that is considered among the finest in Southeast Asia.
The goddesses dance, their bodies curved in impossible grace.
The gods stand in poses of power, tempered by serenity.
The Cham were not primitives waiting to be absorbed by more advanced cultures.
They were a civilization in every sense of the word.
How did this happen? How does a 1,400-year-old civilization disappear so completely from historical memory?
The answer begins with geography. Champa occupied the coastal strip of what is now central and southern Vietnam.
A narrow band of land squeezed between the South China Sea and the Annamite Mountains.
This geography was both Champa's greatest advantage and its fatal weakness. The coastline provided access to maritime trade routes.
The lifeblood of Champa's economy. Cham ports became vital stopping points for ships.
Traveling between China and the ports of the Indian Ocean, spices, silk, ceramics, precious metals, all of it flowed through Cham harbors.
And the kingdom grew wealthy on tariffs and trade.
But that narrow coastal strip was also dangerously exposed.
To the north lay Đại Việt, the Vietnamese kingdom centered in the Red River Delta. To the west, beyond...
And to the south, eventually, would come other pressures. Champa existed in a vice.
Geographically squeezed between expanding powers, and unlike kingdoms with vast hinterlands to retreat into, Champa had nowhere to go. The mountains were impassable.
The pressure came from the north, slowly at first, then with devastating speed.
The Vietnamese, the people who would eventually absorb Champa entirely, began their own history under Chinese domination.
For 1,000 years, from 111 BCE to 938 CE, northern Vietnam was a Chinese province.
But when the Vietnamese finally achieved independence, they didn't become a peaceful, inward-looking nation. They became expansionist.
And the direction of their expansion was inevitable: south.
This southward movement of Vietnamese power has a name in Vietnamese historiography.
It sounds almost benign, like aggression, a natural movement of people. But from the perspective,
it was the systematic, century-by-century destruction of their civilization.
The conflict between Champa and Đại Việt began early as the 10th century, and it never really stopped. It was a grinding, existential struggle that lasted for 800 years. 8 centuries of intermittent war of Cham kingdoms fragmenting, reforming, mounting desperate counterattacks, briefly reclaiming lost territory,
then losing it again, each cycle leaving them weaker, smaller, more fragmented.
In 1471, everything changed. The Vietnamese, under the Lê dynasty, launched a massive invasion of Champa.
This wasn't a border raid or a punitive expedition. This was a war of annihilation.
The Vietnamese army, numbering perhaps 300,000 soldiers, swept down the coast and laid siege to Vijaya, the Cham capital, Luat near present-day Quy Nhơn. The city fell after a brutal siege. What happened next was catastrophic.
The Vietnamese sacked Vijaya with a thoroughness that staggers the imagination.
And taking 30,000 prisoners, including the royal family, 6,000 dead in a single campaign. The capital was burned. The libraries were destroyed. The temples were desecrated. The administrative infrastructure that had held the kingdom together was shattered in months.
But here's what makes 1471 so significant. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a cultural decapitation.
The Vietnamese didn't just conquer Cham territory. They systematically destroyed the ability of Cham civilization to reproduce itself.
The royal lineage was captured or killed. The priestly class, the keepers of Sanskrit learning and...
The craftsmen who built the towers and carved the sculptures were displaced.
The traders who had maintained commercial networks across maritime Southeast Asia lost their ports and their capital.
After 1471, Champa never occurred. What remained was a rump state.
Increasingly isolated, increasingly irrelevant. Over the next 3.5 centuries, even this remnant was slowly absorbed.
In tights. By 1832, when the last Cham king was deposed by the Vietnamese emperor Minh Mang,
the towers fell silent. The language faded. The civilization vanished.
But we need to interrogate our own narrative here, because Vietnamese expansion alone doesn't fully explain Champa's disappearance.
Plenty of kingdoms have been conquered without vanishing. England was conquered by the Normans, but English identity survived.
India was conquered by the Mughals, but Hindu civilization endured. China was conquered by the Mongols, then the Manchus.
But remained fundamentally Chinese. Conquest doesn't automatically equal cultural erasure. So what made Champa different?
Part of the answer lies in demography. Champa was always outnumbered.
Even at its height, the total Cham population probably never exceeded a few 100,000. The Vietnamese
concentrated in the fertile Red River Delta. They could absorb losses that would cripple Champa.
They could send army after army south, and behind those armies came settlers, farmers
who built Vietnamese villages on the ruins of Cham towns.
This agricultural transformation was crucial.
The Vietnamese practiced intensive wet rice agriculture, which could support much higher population densities than the farming and herding methods used by the Cham.
When Vietnamese settlers moved into former Cham territories, they didn't just occupy the land, they fundamentally altered its carrying capacity.
Within a generation or two, Vietnamese farmers outnumbered the remaining Cham population.
Champa didn't just lose territory, it lost the demographic basis for maintaining distinct identity.
There's also the matter of religion. Champa was predominantly Hindu, with Buddhist influences, while the Vietnamese...
Religious difference created a cultural barrier that made assimilation difficult. But here's the crucial point.
Temples were destroyed or converted. Sanskrit texts were burned. Hindu rituals were banned.
The Vietnamese didn't just want Cham land. They wanted to eliminate Cham culture, to make the landscape itself Vietnamese.
This was ethnic cleansing in the truest sense. Not just killing populations, though there was plenty of that.
But erasing the cultural markers that defined a people. Place names were changed from Cham to Vietnamese. Cities were renamed.
Rivers, mountains, landmarks, all were given new Vietnamese names, erasing the Cham linguistic imprint on the landscape.
Today, most people living in central Vietnam have no idea that the land beneath their feet was once Champa.
These brick sanctuaries, called Kalan in Cham, dedicated to Shiva, Vishnu, and other Hindu deities.
Mi Sơn, Po Nagar, Po Klonggarai.
These are the most famous, but there are dozens. What's remarkable about these towers is their artistic sophistication. Cham sculpture, particularly from the 9th to 12th centuries,
is characterized by a fluid, sensuous style, quite different from the more rigid formalism of Khmer or Javanese art.
The figures are dynamic, full of movement and life. The goddesses dance, their bodies curved in impossible grace. The gods stand in poses of power, tempered by serenity. There's a humanity to Cham art, a warmth. That makes the loss of the civilization that created it feel even more tragic.
French colonial archaeologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries were stunned when they began seriously studying these ruins.
They had assumed any sophisticated culture in the region must have been imported from India or China.
But the Cham towers were clearly indigenous developments, showing Indian influence certainly, but transformed into something unique.
The architectural techniques, the decorative motifs, the sculptural style, these were Cham innovations.
Some of the finest examples of Cham art were removed during the colonial period and now reside in museums in Paris and Hanoi.
The Museum of Cham Sculpture in Da Nang houses the world's largest collection. But even there, walking through the...
A torso here, a head there, a lintel, a frieze, pieces of a shattered whole.
It's like trying to understand Renaissance Italy from a handful of statue fragments and architectural details.
You can see the genius, but the context, the living culture that produced it, is gone.
The Cham people themselves survived, but in diaspora and diminishment. Small Cham communities exist in Vietnam today.
Perhaps 150,000 people, most of them Muslim, descendants of Cham who converted to Islam.
Through contact with Malay traders in the 15th and 16th centuries. There are larger Cham populations in Cambodia,
where refugees fled during the final centuries of Champa's collapse. But these communities are disconnected from the classical Cham heritage. The Sanskrit texts are unreadable to them. The Hindu rituals are forgotten. the architectural knowledge.
There's a bitter irony in the fact that we know more about Champa from Chinese and Vietnamese sources than from Cham sources themselves.
The Chinese, who maintained detailed records of their tributary states, left extensive descriptions of Cham embassies.
The Vietnamese chronicles, even as they recorded Champa's destruction, preserve details about Cham society.
But Cham sources themselves, the kingdom's own historical records, its literature, its religious texts, almost none of it survived.
This is the final tragedy of Champa. It was denied the ability to tell its own story.
The Vietnamese wrote the history, and in their telling, Champa appears as an obstacle, a primitive kingdom that resists.
The Cham are portrayed as pirates, raiders, barbarians, who needed to be pacified and civilized.
But when we look at the evidence that survives, the towers, the sculptures, the archaeological remains, a different picture emerges.
We see a sophisticated maritime civilization, a kingdom that participated in vast trading networks,
We see master craftsmen, skilled administrators, bold navigators.
We see a people who built in stone so that their gods would have permanent homes, never imagining that the gods would outlast the people.
The vanishing of Champa offers a dark lesson about the fragility of civilization.
It doesn't matter how sophisticated your culture is, how beautiful your art, how ancient your traditions.
If you're geographically vulnerable, if you're outnumbered, if a stronger neighbor decides it wants your land and has the means to take it, you can disappear. Not over millennia, not through gradual cultural evolution, but within a few centuries, erased so thoroughly
that future generations won't even remember you existed.
But perhaps Champa's story is also a reminder that erasure is never complete. The towers stand.
The sculptures remain, silent witnesses to a vanished world.
Archaeologists continue to excavate Cham sites, uncovering new information, piecing together fragments of the lost civilization. Scholars are working to preserve what little remains of the Cham language, to document the traditions of surviving Cham communities.
And slowly, in Vietnam itself, there's a growing recognition that the Cham past is part of Vietnamese heritage.
That the history of the land includes more than just the Vietnamese story.
The kingdom of Champa vanished, but it's not entirely gone. It exists in the brick towers that dot the Vietnamese coast, in the sculptures that populate museums,
in the genetic and cultural legacy of the Cham people who survived.
It exists in the questions we ask about how civilizations die, about what we lose when cultures disappear, about whose stories get told.
And whose get erased.
And it exists in investigations like this one, attempts to bring forgotten kingdoms back into the light.
To restore to history what history tried to forget. The towers are still there, waiting in the rice paddies and jungle clearings. They have outlasted the kingdom that built them, outlasted the wars that destroyed it, outlasted the empires that tried to erase it.
And as long as they stand, as long as someone remembers to ask, who built these and what happened to them?
The civilization is gone, but the mystery remains, and in that mystery, a kind of immortality.
The investigation continues, and every answer we uncover brings the lost kingdom of Champa one step closer. To the historical recognition it was denied in life, one fragment at a time, deciphered from stone.